Hi everyone. In today's video, I'm going to be demonstrating how to create a new shapefile layer in the version 14 release of Simple GIS Client. And I thought this would be a good video to demonstrate the process of creating a new shapefile layer, since in the version 14 release there has been some fairly significant changes and a lot of capabilities have been added around shapefiles. So for those that may not be familiar, a shapefile is pretty industry standard GIS format that contains both geometry and attribute data. And it's one of the formats that Simple GIS supports, allowing you to collect and edit your own data and visualize data from a variety of sources. And so to begin, I'm going to go ahead and just create a new project. So for my new project screen in Simple GIS, I'm just going to create a default GIS project. And when the Add Base Map dialog box comes up, I'm just going to add the OpenStreetMap internet mapping web mapping service as my base map in the background. And now there are two separate menu areas I can use to create a new shapefile. The first is located in the upper left-hand corner of your map, and it's next to this tool button where you add additional layers to your map. If you notice, there's a drop-down arrow next to this tool button, and if you click on it, you'll get a drop-down menu list. And about midway down through this menu list, you'll see an item called Create New Shapefile Layer from Scratch. So this is the one menu item that you can click on to create a new shapefile layer. The other is located here on the top row of drop-down menus underneath the Layer Edit menu item, located about midway through the set of menu items. If you click on this to reveal the drop-down, you'll see about a third of the way down on the menu items is an item called Create New Shapefile. So you could also click on this menu item. So whether you click on this one or you use the one located here underneath our tool button drop down set, both of these do the same thing, and they allow you to create a new empty shapefile. So as you click on this menu item, you'll be presented with a dialog box, and this dialog is intended to provide some step-by-step guidance for you to create your new shapefile. So the first thing you need to do is enter a file name where you want to store your new shapefile and create it at. So to do that, you just simply click on this button. It has the open folder icon on it, and it says click here to select file name for new shapefile. And as you do so, you'll get this file selection dialog box, and at this point you simply navigate to the folder where you want to create your new shapefile. And I actually have a folder I created here called Shapefile Demo. So I'm going to select it, and then you just enter a name for your new shapefile. So I'm going to call this my shapefile demo. I'll click Save, and as I do, you see it populates the full path and file name for your shapefile in this edit box. Now you just simply click the next button to proceed to the next step. And in the next step, you need to select the type of geometry that your shapefile is going to contain. So if you're not familiar, a shapefile can contain many records, but all of the records have to have the same type of geometry. So they could all be points, they could all be lines, they could all be polygons, or they could all be what we call a multi-point, which a multi-point is just when a single record contains multiple points grouped together as a single feature or record. So in this case, I'm going to select pole, and for today's demonstration, I'm going to assume we're going to be modeling electric utility poles, just as an example. So for that, I would use point as my geometry type, and I'll click Next. And now at this point, this is where I would define any attribute fields that I want to include in my shapefile for modeling my features and for describing my features. So by default, it already has one field that it added, and this is called a unique ID. So one of the things that Simple GIS supports, and it only supports it while you're running the shapefile in Simple GIS is this thing called a primary key or a unique ID field. And what this is a field that Simple GIS automatically populates as you add new records into the shapefile with a unique number to uniquely identify that record. And this is useful for some of the other field types. As we go through this, you'll see for managing things like linked documents, photos, or even other tables that you want to link to a shapefile. And we'll cover that in a minute, so hopefully that'll become clearer. So this is added by default, but I'm going to add a few more fields. And so I'm going to click on this Add Field button. And the next field I'm going to add, since we're modeling poles, I'm going to add a field called Height. And this will represent the height of the field. And here, as I've entered the field name, underneath it you'll see that I would select the type of field that I'm wanting to model. So in this case, my height is just going to be a simple integer value. And so I select that radio button. And as I do, since it's a number, I see that the field width is grayed out because that's not relevant now. But I have this other edit box where I can enter an alias for my field name. So a shapefile, by definition, its field names are limited to 11 characters, which obviously are not a lot of characters to provide a very descriptive title for your field name. So what the field alias allows you to do is define a more descriptive title for your field, and it's this label that will actually be used next to the field edit boxes in your attribute form, as well as if you're viewing the table attribute table, the table grid view of your shapefile in Simple GIS. These whatever you entered in for a field alias would appear as the column headings. Otherwise, if you didn't have this field alias populated, it would just use the field name. So this is an optional field. So in this case, though, as you can see, I can enter a more descriptive label for my field. So I'm going to just call this pole height. I'll click apply. And then if I needed to go back and edit any particular field, I could just double click on the field, and you see that it would bring you back to the field definition, where you can edit any of these values. So I'm going to leave that as is. Then I'm going to add another field, and I'll call this class. So for electric utility poles, they are defined by both a height and a class, where the class just defines the thickness or diameter of the pole, which of course the thicker the pole or larger the diameter, the stronger the pole. So again, that's going to be an integer field as well. I'll just call this pole class. And then I'll add another field, and for this field name, maybe I'll call this material to represent the type of material the pole is made out of. And for the alias, I'll just call it pole material. Now, if you've seen all of these different field types you can define here for a shapefile, if you've ever used shapefiles before, you'll notice that these are extended from what you would traditionally see for a shapefile. And these are special field types that Simple GIS defines that allows you to do things like if we wanted this to be a lookup value list, I would select the lookup values, and here for the values I would type in the possible values that I wanted to use for this particular field. So for instance, for material I could have wood, I could have steel, or I could have concrete. And what this does is in the attribute data form, as a user is editing data for a particular pole, for this field they would get a drop-down list where they could select one of these values rather than having to type this information in. So one, it helps with data validation by making sure they've selected a predefined list, and also speeds up the data collection as well. So I'm going to leave that set. I'll click apply. And then other fields you can add that is unique to Simple GIS. Let's say if I wanted photos. I won't use a field alias for this. It's pretty self-explanatory, but a photo is, I can define a linked document or file, a photo or photo album. And what this is, it provides a link so that users, if for instance, if I linked in a document like a PDF document, it could be a Word document, an Excel spreadsheet, it could be really any type of document, it could even be a video file. And as users would view this data in the attribute dialog box, they would see a link, much like a URL link, that they could click on and launch that document. Same thing with photos. I could do it like a single photo or a photo album when you have a group of photos. And what that allows you to do is add photos of features into your shapefile. And in the attribute data form, the users would see thumbnail previews of the photos. And of course, then they could double click on the thumbnail to view the full-size image of the photo. And all of this would be managed with a shapefile. And so I'll explain that a little bit in further detail as we go through this example. But for now, I'm just going to define this field called photos. I want to make it a photo album. And click apply. And then we could also do things like date fields. So I could add a field and I could call this let's just call this the inspection date. And for my alias, I'll just call it poll inspection date. And I could define this as a date field. And when I define this as a date field, it's really a special string formatted field. But when the user is editing the data in their attribute data form, for this field, they would actually see a calendar control with the date. And then they could select the new date by just clicking on that control, and they'd get a nice little calendar control that they could select a date from. And so this allows for easy entry of date information. You can also have dates auto-populate. And so, for instance, if I had more than one date field in a particular shapefile, I could have one of the date fields populated based upon the date value in another field. So that would act as a starting date. And then I could increment that date by a prescribed number of days just by typing a number in here. Or I could use the value from another field that's been defined in my shapefile, another numeric field. So for instance, if I click on the drop down, I would see a list of fields that are numeric. And so I could use them. So if I had let's say a specific inspection cycle or maintenance cycle by each individual feature in my shapefile, I could have that value stored in another attribute field in my shapefile and use that value to increment when the next inspection date would be due, based upon the field we select for the starting date plus that increment. Or conversely, if I had a link table where I was keeping a history of inspections on that feature, I could use the last inspection date or the most recent inspection date out of all of the related records in that table to act as my starting date. And so that's what this radio group here is for, is if I had a link table where I was keeping let's say a log or a history of inspections or other activity that was done on this particular feature, I could use the maximum date out of those related records for that specific feature or the minimum date as my starting date if I was doing an auto-populate. So in this case, I'm just going to leave this. It's not going to be an auto-populated field. I'm just going to have it as a simple date field. And it's going to be my poll inspection date. And I'll click apply. And now maybe I'll add another field that will have when the next inspection is due. I'm going to call this next inspection. And it's going to be a date field as well. And in this case, I'm going to add my field alias. And for this one, I am going to make it auto-populated based upon the date entered for the inspection date. And I want to increment it by 365 days. So let's say my plan is to inspect the polls once per year. So as the user would enter in an inspection date, then this field would be auto-populated based upon that date they entered, increment it by 365 days. So I'll click apply. Now that we have these attribute fields, and I think that's enough for now, we click on the next button to proceed to the next step. And this is where I can add link tables. And so a link table is a good way, as I mentioned earlier, if you wanted to record inspection history on a pole. You know, for instance, if you had inspections on a piece of equipment, you could record who did the inspection, when they did it, what their findings were, anything like that, and you could keep a running history of all the inspections on that feature. You could use it for assemblies. So for instance, if you had for this electric utility pole, if I had different assemblies attached to this pole, you know, for instance, if I had a cross arm and insulators or any type of electrical equipment, I could record all of that equipment on this pole in what we call a link table. And a link table is really when you have like a one-to-many relationship. So for instance, if you consider the inspections example, you know, if I had a single pole and I had many inspections for that pole, which represents the history of inspections on that pole, I have one pole feature, but I have many inspection records that's all related to that single pole. And so that's what a link table is really useful for. In this case, we're going to add a link table, and then as we click on this add link table, we need to give a name for our new table. And I'm just going to call it assemblies. And so what we're going to do here is use this table to describe the different material components that are a part of this pole. So I'll click OK. And when I do, I get a new dialog box with attribute fields that I need to define for my new table that I'm creating. It's created two new fields by default that's required. One is the record ID, which very similar to the shapefile is a unique ID that uniquely identifies each record in the table using a unique number. And then I have the FID, which is related to the unique number in the shapefile. And these are required to establish the relationships between the feature in your shapefile and the records in this link table. And so you can't edit these. These are required fields, but you can add additional fields if you need to, just by clicking the Add Field button. And very similar to the shapefile, you can define all of these different field types. So I'm going to put a unit number. This is going to be an assembly unit number that describes some type of material that's connected to the pole. So I'm going to leave this width set to 25, that's fine. And then I'll add another field for the description of the material, and I'll make this a little bit wider, let's say 100, but it's still going to be a string field. Apply. And then maybe I need to put in a quantity here too. And this is going to be an integer since this is just representing the quantity of the material. Or assembly. You know, depending on whether you're modeling individual pieces of material or assemblies, which represents a collection of material. And I think that's good for the purpose of this. You could also, if you wanted to sort the records in any particular order in the table, as you're viewing the data, you just select the field that you wanted to sort it by here from the drop-down list, and then what order you wanted to sort the records in. So once you're done, click Apply. And you see now I have this entry in from my link table called Assemblies. If I needed to edit this table, I could just simply double-click on it to bring this dialog box back up, and I can make any revisions I needed to for this particular feature. So cancel for now. And so at this point, you've done everything you need to do. The very last step, let me shrink this box down, is click on this button called Create Shapefile. And when you do, you're going to get a prompt that says, do you want to add your new shapefile to your view? And I'm select yes. It's added this new layer to my map that I see here. And of course the legend is this blue star. I'm going to change the legend to make it more representative of poles. So I'm just double clicked on the layer name here in my table of contents. And on my layer properties dialog box, I'm going to click on legends. And for my legend type, I'll just click on this symbol. I want it to be a simple legend, which means I'm using the same symbol for all the features. And I'll just select this round circle. To me, is more indicative of a pole. And I'll click apply. And there it is. And I'm going to turn my layer on, but of course I have no features right now. It's a new empty layer I just created. So let me just kind of zoom in around the area. Actually, I really don't have to get any close to anywhere. But just for the purposes of this, let's zoom in a little more where you can see more detail. So at this point in time, I can start editing my shapefile. So I can right click on the layer and say toggle layer edit, and I'll notice this X that was black turns to red, indicating that it's in an edit state. And now on my edit feature tool drop down list, it's located here on the second row of tool buttons all the way at the end. If I click on this drop down arrow, one of the options I have is called add point feature. Since this is a point shapefile, that's what I would need to select to add a new feature. And if I select that and then click on a location on the map to add the point, so this is what I wanted to show you is what you have now is the default attribute data dialog box that uses all of those field definitions that we specified for the shapefile to create this default dialog. And so here you'll notice it's using the field aliases for the labels for the next to the fields that we need to enter. You see the dates that we defined as date fields here, and as I mentioned, if you click on this, you see that you get the calendar control to modify the date. And then also, if you notice this next inspection due, remember this is the date field we specified as an auto-populated based upon this starting date that was entered here, and we set the increment to 365 days from whatever the starting date was that we entered here. And we notice as we changed that date, it automatically populated this next inspection due by 365 days. So we entered March 30th of 2022, and this automatically went to March 30th of 2023. And this is not editable because this is we said this is to be auto-populated based upon those rules we specified. A couple of other things I just want to mention. So we have the pole height here. And if you remember, we defined this as an integer field. So if I was to try and type a letter or anything else in it, I can't do it. All it will accept is integer values. Even if I tried to enter a decimal or anything like that, it would not take it because we had defined this as an integer field. And so then we have the pole class, and it's the same thing. It would only take integer values because we defined this as an integer field. Then we have the pole material that we define as a drop-down or lookup values. And we notice we now have this drop-down list. And here is the values that we stipulated. So here you would select the type of material. Now, with these lookup values, it doesn't preclude you. If you needed to add a new value to this list, you can simply type that value in. And as you was to move away from this field, it would ask you, are you wanting to, the value you entered didn't match the value in the list. Do you want to edit your lookup list to now include this as a valid value? And if you click apply, it will add that to your drop-down list. And so now it becomes part of the drop-down. Now the photos, as I mentioned, this is where you can add in photos that will show us thumbnail images here, which we don't have any loaded. And to add photos, you can either select photos from a hard drive on your laptop, or whatever drive, accessible drive you're connected to. Or if you are, let's say you were running this on a laptop or a tablet device that was running Microsoft Windows, and it had a camera installed on that device, you could use this camera control to actually access that camera if you wanted to take a photo in the field. In this case, on this particular machine, this is a desktop machine I'm running on. So I'm going to select this folder button here. And this allows me to come up to manage photos where I can add individual photos. I can remove selected photos. So I'm going to click on the add photo. I get this new dialog box and I can just select, the different folder locations, and then I can select the particular photo, any JPEG, TIFF image, bitmap, anything like that I wanted to add. So I could just double click on a photo item to add that as a photo, and I could select multiple photos if I wanted to. And as I close the form, I now see the nice little thumbnail image here. And then here is the link table in this table grid below. And so if I wanted to add records into this table, I could click on this plus button, and now I get a new little pop-up attribute form based upon the fields we defined for the table. And now I could enter in the different items that we wanted here. So I could enter in the, in this case I was doing assembly units, material assembly units. So I could say this is a tangent 8-foot cross arm 15 kV, something like that. Whatever the description that you want for it. And as I do that, you see that it's added this record in this table. Now to view the data in this table in an easier view, or to edit the data, I simply just double click on the record in the table and I get the nice little pop-up form again. And then I can add additional fields. So now let's say I wanted a something like this. And so I just continue to add records as I need it here. And now I have all of these assemblies added. Now if I wanted to publish a report of this, I could do that. This just brings up a, creates an Excel report of this information. So I'm just going to overwrite. When you click on that, you'll get this file dialog box. You can enter in a new file name for your Excel report and wherever you want to save it at. Or you can overwrite an existing one if you want it to. And I'm just going to overwrite this one here. I'm going to let Excel go ahead and launch. It'll create the report, go ahead and launch Excel and give you the report. And so here is the information. Actually, it didn't have all of the poll information because it actually hasn't saved it yet until I close my dialog box. So let me close Excel right quick. And we'll click OK. And now let me view this data again. And now if I was to publish the report, since I closed the dialog box, it now actually saved all of the information I entered to that feature. And now when it opens, you see I have all of this populated. So the poll height, the poll material, next inspection due, poll class, poll inspection date, and then all of the assembly information, the related information as well. Now, if I was not editing this feature, if I was to right-click on this layer and select Toggle Layer Edit Off, and now if I was to view the attribute data using the View Feature Data tool button and click on this poll feature, I would see all of this information, but you notice the button icons, the button with the open folder and the camera is no longer available. As well as the plus or minus to add or delete records from the table are no longer available. And you see I don't have a drop-down list for my poll material, and that's because I'm not editing. So now it's just displaying the data that's there, so I can't edit any of this data. However, I can, for instance, double click on this photo and you'll see it'll bring up the full-size image of that photo. Same thing if this was a linked documents that I was adding, I could click on them to bring up those documents. And I can still double click on any of these records in the link table here below to bring up its pop-up form to view additional information. So I could have photos even related or other linked documents related to these individual records in the table, and if I was to double click on that record, it would show those images and that information in this pop-up form. So this might be useful if you were recording, for instance, maintenance activity or inspections done, and there were some related photos or documents related to that inspection or maintenance for historical references or recording purposes. You could attach them into this table, and then it would show as you double click on that form. Now, just to clarify, these photos or any documents like that, when we link them, we're not just simply referencing a link to where the photo was stored at. It's actually creating a copy of the photo and storing it in a special folder location in the root where the shapefile is located at. Same thing with this link table here. So if I open up my File Explorer, and if I was to go in, this is where I created the shapefile at. And if you notice, I have two special folders here. One is called My Shapefile Demo Shape, so it has the same file name as my shapefile name, just with this _docs appended to it. And this is where it would create a series of special folders if needed, or put documents underneath here that we have linked. And so if I open this up, here is the copy of the photo that it copied into this special folder. And that's because by default it's going to manage this information. So if I was to delete this feature record, it would delete these photos out of this folder and clean up after itself. And so this is really acting like a self-contained database. So anything in this folder, so here's the My Shapefile Demo Shapefile that would create it. And just if you're not familiar again with shapefiles, a shapefile is a combination of multiple files. You have the SHP file extension, which is the file that stores all the geometry information. You have the DBF file, which is all the attribute data that's stored in it. And then you have some other file names like the SHX, which acts as the file that links each record in the geometry here, each feature, to the attribute data stored in the DBF table. And then you have some other files. Depending upon the software that you use, there may be some ancillary files that's created just for managing the shapefile or for performance reasons. And then in case of simple GIS, if you've created any special fields like photos or linked documents or linked tables, you'll have some additional folders created to store that information in to be able to manage with the shapefile. So the docs contains all the linked documents, and then the same thing, you have a My Shapefile Demo, so same file name as the shapefile, just with a TBLS for tables appended to the end. And if you open that, that would be any linked tables that you created and associated with your shapefile. And so what this does is it makes it real easy. If you wanted to transfer this shapefile to another machine or to another user, you could take the contents of this folder, the shapefile plus its subfolders here. For instance, you could zip them up into a zip drive or something like that, send it to someone, they unzip it, and then as long as they reference this information in this this way, all of that information is contained and it's still within, you don't have to worry about any links being broken or anything like that. And so it's all contained as its own database, essentially, is what it's doing. And so that is really the extent of this demonstration that we wanted to cover here today. If this was useful, I do ask, please just click on the subscribe button located at the bottom of this video to subscribe to our YouTube tutorial channels for Simple GIS. I also encourage you to visit our website. That website is simplegissoftware.com, all one word. It's included in the description of this video as well. And with that, I'll bid you farewell. Hope you had a good day and hope this was useful. Thank you.